Hi everyone. You wrote in some great questions from Mrs. Temple's third grade class after watching our elementary school history videos, and we're going to take some time to answer just a few of them. Thanks for writing in your questions. They're fantastic. Right, Logan?
Yeah.
Alright, Logan.
Yeah.
First question is for you.
Okay, for me. All right.
Yeah,
What is it?
it's a pretty heavy one, so they're specifically talking about the lead up and the aftermath of the U.S. Dakota War.
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't the settlers give food and a place to live to the Indians when they made a deal? And they're referring to the treaties that the Indians and the settlers agreed to.
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of people were involved in the treaties, in people who were supposed to honor the deal, who were supposed to keep up the deal, and who didn't. And for each person, there was a different reason. For some people, it was because they could have made more money by not honoring the deal. For some people, they didn't like the Indians personally, and that is part of why they didn't do it. So there were a lot of different reasons, but I would say for some people, there was a way to make money by not honoring the deal, and for some people, it was racism.
Yeah,
That's part of it.
Yeah, and a lot of that came from leadership as well.
Yeah.
Settlers were told to fear the Indians. Settlers were told that the Indians were going to go extinct anyway, and that they just needed to get them off the land. So a lot of it came from the leadership, and Logan's right, it came for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah. We have a question about a little bit earlier in Minnesota history.
Oh.
Can you tell us about the animals that lived a long time ago?
Yeah, so like most places, Minnesota had dinosaurs, they had mammoths, and even for a period of time there was this vast ocean that covered most of Minnesota. So a lot of the fossils we see are actually from ocean animals that lived here a long, long time ago. So over the course of millions of years, we've had a lot of different types of animals. But one of my favorite is there was basically this giant beaver that existed. It was a beaver that ranged from the size of a large dog, like a lab, to the size of a small grizzly bear. And it was basically exactly what beavers are like now, just enormous. And I just think that would be wonderful. So the giant beaver is one of my favorite prehistoric animals.
Would you want a giant beaver as a pet? What would you do with one?
A pet makes it sound. I don't think I could rightfully claim a beaver as a pet that could,
Okay.
bite me in half.
Would you ride it?
Yes, I would want a giant beaver as a friend,
Okay.
as a companion,
Gotcha.
sort of a symbiotic relationship rather than a pet owner relationship. I think I would be dependent on the beaver more than the beaver would be dependent on me.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. Logan.
Yeah.
So one of the kids asked, actually a lot of the kids asked, how did you learn so much about local history?
Well, that's a great question. We talked about it a little bit in one of our episodes, but really, your teachers are such a great resource.
Especially Mrs. Temple.
Yeah. I learned so much from my history teachers in elementary, middle school, and high school. Throughout the rest of your time as a student, they're going to be such a great resource for you. Northfield and Rice County in general have some really, really wonderful teachers, some really great people. So whenever you have a question about history, ask your teacher. And if you want to learn more outside of school, there's so many museums in Rice County as well. There's the Northfield Historical Society in Northfield. There's the Rice County Historical Society in Faribault. Both really wonderful museums with great people who you can go out, check out the exhibits, see some of their bones from some of the animals that Sam was talking about at the Rice County Historical Society. There's a lot of great stuff about the bank raid at the Northfield Historical Society. So there's a lot of great museums and great people in the towns too, even outside of school, that you can learn about local history.
Absolutely, and the local libraries are always great resources as well. The Buckham Memorial Library and the Northfield Public Library, they have great staff that will be very helpful for whatever your interests are.
That's right. I have a question for Sam, kind of similar to our other question.
Mm-hmm.
So you talked about there were a lot of different environments that Minnesota's been through the years, and one of those is the Ice Age, when you talk about the mammoths. So how did animals survive in the Ice Age is part one of the question. This is a multiple part question. What do you think?
Yeah, so the first half is basically something called natural selection. And that is a very long process that takes place over generations and generations of animals. It's also known sometimes as evolution. Basically, as the world got colder through something like an ice age, the animals that had thicker fur or hides that protected their inner organs from getting cold, they were the animals that survived, and so they were the animals that had babies who also had thicker fur, and the thicker the fur, the better you were to survive, so the more likely your genes were going to be passed on. Now, it's not like animals over the course of their life. You know, if I went back to the Ice Age, I wasn't going to grow thicker fur in my lifetime, but if I had 2 children, and one child had a lot of hair, kind of like, imagine kind of Logan's face here, and one of them was, you know, clean shaven and couldn't really grow a beard, and he did a better job surviving, he was more likely going to survive and have children. Is that a good?
That's a pretty good thing. And actually, it's a referring back to me as a good segue into the next part of the question, which is talking about a different Ice Age hairy creature. Is Bigfoot real? Do you think? And a follow-up question. This is from Crosby, who's wondering: is Paul Bunyan Bigfoot? Maybe. Is that the answer to the age-old question?
Crosby, I think you've really stumbled into a phenomenal, this is what's called a hypothesis. So your hypothesis is your initial guess. Now you need to go through experiments, you need to look through research, and eventually you will have a solid theory here that indeed Paul Bunyan is a Bigfoot. So I think that's a solid hypothesis, and I'd love to work with you, Crosby, to get that proven.
Great.
So that's a bit of a non-answer, but
that's good.
Yeah. So a lot of what we talked about was downtown Northfield, and that area, and a lot of kids are familiar with that being in school in Northfield. So they were wondering, how long ago was Bridge Square built?
Great question.
And why is it called Bridge Square?
Yeah. So Bridge Square is actually the site where, when John North came in, you guys remember John North, who Northfield is named after. When he came to Northfield, he wanted to build a mill, and we talked a little bit about mills in one of our episodes, where so much grain could be made, where food could be made, and supplies could be made for a town, and people could make money. So John North wanted to make a mill in this nice area, and he stumbled across this area where on one side there was a flat slot of ground in the prairie, and on the other side there were a bunch of woods, lots of trees where you could get wood to make a mill. And so he found this spot. One side of the river is the woods, the other side of the river is the prairie, and on both sides of the river he started building his mill. And today that spot is Bridge Square, and it's called Bridge Square because that bridge is on the square.
Yeah.
If you've ever gone there, you'll notice that over to get to by what's now Froggy Bottoms, or a couple of Basil's Pizza is a great spot over on that side. Crossing in between there and Bridge Square is the Iron Bridge. And when that was constructed in the 1860s, I think, it changed the name of the square to Bridge Square.
Sometimes people were creative in naming things, and sometimes they weren't. I think is the best answer.
Yeah.
I think
you
got one for me. You got one.
That's
for me.
right. That's right. I do. You're so right. Well, I just mentioned the big woods. We talked about the woods that were on one side of the river. There are not woods right there right now.
Right.
Over there. One student asked, why did the big woods get smaller? What happened there? Did they cut down the trees? What was the situation?
Pretty much, yeah. So as settlers were coming in and they wanted to settle in a certain place, whether it was near a town or they just liked the location, they would have to clear out any trees or foliage that were there. So if you chose a place on the prairie, that might be easier because you just have to take out, the tall grasses and things like that. But if you wanted to settle somewhere in the woods, you'd have to clear out all that land. But it wasn't just settlers making room for a home. People also made money. Timber, which is wood that's used in construction and in building things. Timber was a very large industry, and there was a lot of money to be made. And Minnesota, when people were starting to settle in the early 1800s, there was a lot of basically untapped resources. So people could make a lot of money by cutting down, milling, and then selling the wood that came from Minnesota. So a lot of the big woods that was all across Minnesota, and especially in southern Minnesota, now it's been reduced to small patches of nature reserves, or the Big Woods State Park is all that's left of the original Big Woods. But a lot of people cut it down either because they wanted to live there or because they could make money selling the timber.
Great question.
Yeah.
Sam, you got one?
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about the Northfield Bank raid, the failed robbery from the James Younger Gang from 1876. So they're wondering which bank did the James Younger Gang rob, and how many people did they kill, and how much money did they steal?
So, great question. So, the bank that the James Younger Gang robbed was the First National Bank of Northfield. Really the only big bank in the town. The James Younger Gang, you asked how many people died. The James Younger Gang killed Joseph Lee Haywood, the cashier in the bank, and a Swedish man named Nicholas Gustafson was out on the street. And a bullet hit just the top of his head, and he was okay at first, but a couple days later, the wound was infected, and he died from that wound a couple days later. And then the last question, I believe, was how much money they took. There was $15,000 in the bank at that time. So money changes value over time. So $15,000 back then means about $250,000 today. So there was a lot of money in the bank. But because Joseph Lee Haywood stopped them on the inside, and the citizens of Northfield halted them on the outside, they only took about $27 of that money. So the James Younger Gang really did fail as a result of the work of Joseph Lee Haywood and the citizens of Northfield.
Yeah, great question.
Hey Sam.
Yes.
Question for you. Was there dogs back then?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, all the way from indigenous people to settlers, they all had dogs as companions for either hunting, gathering, or just to have around, to catch small pests and things like that around a camp, or just to keep them company.
Great.
Logan.
Yeah.
Last question for you.
Okay.
What is Northfield from? Like the word Northfield.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but so John North came from New York in the early 1850s. And he was looking for a place to make some money, looking for a place to build a town, and he found this wonderful area in southern Minnesota. And there were actually some people already living there. There were some German settlers, some people who had come to farm around the area. And John North talked to them, and he was like, what if we build a mill here? What if we have a town here? And they were like, sure. And then they were like, what do we call it? And John North was like, wow. And then they were like, okay, let's call it Northfield.
Yeah, because just north would have been confusing.
That's true.
Because it's a cardinal direction and everything like that.
Yeah.
Like we said, some people weren't very creative about how they named things.
No, they
back then.
weren't.
Yeah.
Question for you, Sam.
Okay.
A little bit a heavier one for you too. So,
Okay.
We talked about in the U.S. Dakota War, there were a lot of Dakota who didn't fight at all. Mm-hmm. They didn't participate in the fighting, but the settlers were still mad at a lot of the Dakota who didn't fight. And this question asks, why were they mad at the Dakota people even though they didn't fight?
Yeah. So that is a really big question, but I think it's something that we're still having to deal with today. And like we said before, a lot of it has to do with leadership. A lot of it has to do with, the leaders were upset too, and they wanted to get certain things accomplished. Some of those things required the land that the Dakota were on, so it helped to make generalizations. But mostly, when we are in a collective anger, or when we're grieving people who were lost in a violent attack like the settlers experienced with the U.S. Dakota War, sometimes we generalize as human beings. We like to generalize groups into easy ways of dividing people up, whether it's based on the color of someone's skin, whether it's based on the language someone speaks, where they come from, what they believe. So when we divide people up, it makes it easier to understand the world. It makes it easier to understand why people would do such horrible things. But that's fundamentally wrong, because every Dakota person did not do a violent act. Just like every white person didn't do a violent act against the Dakota. But when everyone was in that collective anger, it became really difficult to divide the people who actually committed the crimes from the other people who looked like them. So I think that's one of the lessons we can take from history, is to be sure when these things happen, that we don't let our collective anger take over and make generalizations about an entire group of people who had nothing to do with a violent attack. But a lot of it was the grieving that people were experiencing that was sort of heightened by the leaders, by the local media, to make people even angrier.
Great. And then a final question. You're from Faribault, I'm from Northfield. Faribault or Northfield? What's the oldest town?
That would be Faribault. Faribault was, settled and turned into a town long before little old Northfield, and actually was officially platted out and made a town in Minnesota Territory in the spring of 1855, or was it a state by then?
No.
It was still territory. Okay, you gave me a look and I lost all confidence. Faribault was platted out in the spring of 1855. Northfield wasn't platted out until the fall of 1855. So they both get 1855, but Faribault takes the cake on that one. Yeah, so thank you guys for submitting those wonderful questions. Mrs. Temple's class of 2021, thank you so much for your interest in history, for enjoying the videos. You all had some very nice things to say about this goofy thing that Logan and I recorded during the lockdowns last year. So thank you so much. We're glad that we could get you excited about history. Keep asking those great questions, and we hope to see you around at museums or libraries or taking part in our local history.
See you later, and watch out for Bigfoot.
Yeah.